Actually, Emma, I think it was your idea of Pesach, right before Pesach. You wanted to do something special for the Nili program. And I think you did it that time with Rivi. You had it, right? You had it to all the Chicagoans who somehow sometimes come to Israel for Pesach, or they're missing Israel. Anyway, in the end, they weren't able to come in the summer either. And I think you did a tiyol too with something with Har HaBayit and the southern walls. So, and that from there, we just realized that it could be done. I think you brought 100 people with you. Had 100 Chicagoans on this virtual tiyol. And right, Shulie, that was one of your first, Shulie, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, for Yom Yerushalayim, we did it. Yes, we had many people.
No, we did. That was a Matan, but no, that wasn't the Chicago. Rivi. Oh, I'm sorry, Rivi did it. Rivi did it then with Rivi did it with Emma as they were classmates in Eshkolot.
Nice.
But right, Chicago. Yes, following in your footsteps, literally, Shulie. Many others who are also going into this, into the tour guiding, into bringing up developing the love for Eretz Yisrael. And I want to mention that we're very proud of Emma and all our, all our Eshkolot graduates, the Bellows Eshkolot Educators Program. It's now in its 5th year, and their graduates already taking key positions in leading high schools in the New York, New Jersey, Chicago, Emma and Nili running Batei Midrash, Cleveland, Los Angeles. This year, not only are there women a group studying in Israel, but we're Zooming classes to London as well, to Australia. So a lot is going on, and the emphasis is on Tanakh, to really connect the educators, the teachers to our Tanakh. I wanted to mention that as now we're transitioning from Bereshit to Shemot. We had the Chazak v'Nitchazek this past Shabbat, and we go into Shemot, and there's a similar ending of Bereshit and the beginning of Shemot with the names. However, there's a difference because we're moving from family to nation. And all of Sefer Bereshit, I think, tells us our strong roots as a family, Bnei Yaakov. But now we enter Mitzrayim, and the name changes. It's no longer Bnei Yaakov. We're transitioning from the family to the nation. But the Hashem gave us in the Torah, we were given the entire book of Bereshit, 50 chapters, to remind us that we're family. And I think this is so beautiful now that we're all here as family. I know there are people here from New York, right? Jews, Am Yisrael from New York, from Chicago, from Israel, Yerushalayim, Modi'in, Shulie from Efrat, from all over.
Close.
Pardon?
Alon Shvut.
Okay, got it. Close to Efrat. Alon Shvut. But the key here is Chicago. The key is Chicago, and we wanted this family connection. And family connection means you get together. And if we can't get together physically, there's no the traveling, the COVID, unfortunately. At least via Zoom, we have this connection. And we wanted to make the connection through a learning experience, through a connection to Eretz Yisrael. We'd like to thank the Bellows for their wonderful friendship and sponsorship of so much that goes on in Matan, especially the educators, the Bellows Eshkolot Educators Program. And you have a lot to be proud of, very proud of these articulate and relevant, inspiring educators that you've put out all over the world. So we're happy. We're proud to also now to be with Emma, who will lead us into the evening. The head of the Nili, the Women's Beit Midrash in Chicago. We thank everyone from wherever you are, our whole family, our mishpacha together. Nava, thank you for all the efforts you put into organizing this wonderful evening. And just just one little thing. Harat Sofim, when I first came to Israel in 1967, there were buildings there, but nothing much else. And I remember we went there with the Mechlala on a tiyul. Now, since then, I've had a baby there. My husband had a bit of a surgery there. We've had other things. I've used the library in Harat Sofim, but to go backtrack as in a tiyul, I'm really excited, and I'd like to kind of climb up there, get up there to Harat Sofim. Thank you, Emma, also for all your efforts in organizing the evening. It's wonderful. Soon I'm going to scroll and see who's here. But welcome to everybody, all our family together, and a good evening. Emma.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emma Katz. Thank you so much, Rabbanit Bina, for that nice introduction. And yes, the idea to create the event this morning, this evening, depending on where you are. Sorry if you hear my children in the background. Beautiful sounds of young people excited to hear Torah. The idea was we're stuck here in freezing cold Chicago, and we wanted to get away a little bit. And we know it's hard that everyone with the lockdowns and all of the limitations that we've had over the past number of months, we just need to mentally get away and go visit specifically Eretz Yisrael, which feels so distant right now, and that's so hard for so many of us. So for anyone who is new to Neely, but an old friend of Matan, or an old friend of Neely and new to Matan, both are really fantastic organizations. Neely is the women's initiative of the YU Torah Mitzion Kollel in Chicago. And Matan is a fantastic women's Beit Midrash in Yerushalayim and with branches all over Israel. I had the zchut to be in the Bellows Eshkolot program in Matan, where I was able to learn Tanakh from some of the top educators in the field. And just be surrounded by Torah Eretz Yisrael before coming here to Chicago and assuming my role as director of Neely. So I get to take the Tanakh that I learned in Eretz Yisrael and give it over and use it to fuel the programming that happens here in Chicago. So thank you to Nava for organizing all of this, to Rabbanit Bina for your introduction, for everything you do for Matan, and to Shulie for speaking and giving us this tour this morning or this evening. So with no further ado, Shulie, I had the amazing benefit of being able to tour with her in person, and I am so excited that even though I'm not physically in Eretz Yisrael, I can continue to tour with her. So thank you, Shulie.
Thank you, Emma. Okay, so you are making me host so I can share my screen, right? Because that I need to do. Hi, everybody. So wonderful to see familiar names, familiar faces, new people. Welcome. And yes, we have to tour virtually, but we're going to make the best of it. And the good thing is that in an hour, you can do what would take 4 hours in real life. So there is that advantage to it. So thank you to Matan. Thank you to Neely. And with no further ado, we are going to get started because we have a lot to see and a lot to do. Okay, so here we go. And we are going up onto Har HaTzofim, Mount Scopus. I will talk about the name a little. And we're going to try to understand a lot of different aspects about Mount Scopus. First of all, the fact that it's outside the city, but it's very close to it, right? Even the name, Sofim. Oh, let me just add, I'll say this at the beginning. Anyone who has questions, I would love to answer questions. I'm not going to look at the chat while I'm teaching because it's just too distracting, but I am happy to answer any questions at the end. And then also, obviously, you can all unmute yourselves and ask questions, not just in writing. Okay, so that's just the intro. Okay, so Har HaTzofim, we are Tzofeh, we are looking onto Jerusalem, and it's not in the city, but it's very close to the city, and that's going to be part of the story. On the one hand, because it's outside the city, it was used as a staging ground for armies. For example, Titus, when he comes and he attacks Jerusalem, in the Great Revolt, where he ultimately conquers the city and burns down the Beit HaMikdash. He's coming from the north. Mitzafon tipatach hara'a, evil shall begin from the north. And he camps on Har HaTzofim. Okay, Rabbi Akiva, when he is coming to see the ruins of the Mikdash, and he's coming with his friends, and we have that immortal story in the Gemara and Makot, where they see the fox coming out of the Kodesh Kodashim, and everyone starts to cry, and Rabbi Akiva starts to laugh, right? Why is he laughing? Because we've reached the bottom, and from here there's nowhere to go but up, okay? And that's when he's going, but Sofim. Where exactly that is, we're going to try to understand, but basically we are outside of Jerusalem, but very, very close to Jerusalem. And that's going to be the key to understanding the institutions that are put here: burial grounds and a more modern cemetery, hospital, university. Okay, the closeness to the city is very, very significant, is very important to our story. Okay. Are we on Har HaTzofim, or are we on Har HaZeitim? Are we on Mount Scopus or on Mount of Olives? Okay, and this is, of course, the story that I mentioned before in the Gemara and Makot. On another occasion, they were ascending to Jerusalem after the destruction of the temple. When they arrived at Mount Scopus, right, which really in the text it says Sofim, not Har HaTzofim, and saw the site of the temple, they rent their garments in mourning, in keeping with halachic practice. When they arrived at Temple Mount, they saw a fox that emerged from the site of the Holy of Holies. They began weeping, and Rabbi Akiva was laughing. Now, where is this Sofim? So it's got to be somewhere from where you can see Har HaBayit. Anybody who has been up to Har HaTzofim, particularly to certain areas of the university where you have the most unbelievable views, both out to the desert and into the old city, it definitely fits, it definitely works. But like many mountains in the land of Israel, right, Har HaZeitim, the Mount of Olives, is not one little kind of a gumdroppy shaped mountain. It's a mountain range, and Har HaTzofim is one piece, okay, the northernmost piece of that mountain range of Har HaZeitim. Why does it get its own name? Okay, well, maybe because you have such a great view from there, but you have a pretty good view from the rest of Har HaZeitim as well. So one suggestion is this the real Sofim? Is it not? We don't know. But when they start to fundraise for Hebrew University, which is going to be placed on Har HaTzofim, as we're going to hear in a little bit, they go to America to fundraise, and you can't exactly go and say, we're going to make a university on Har HaZeitim. What's everybody's connection? What's everybody's intuition when they hear the word Har HaZeitim? They think of the cemetery, right? Think of a cemetery. We don't want them to think of a cemetery. So we're going to rebrand the mountain, give it a new name, and call it Har HaTzofim, Mount Scopus, which is this name that is connected to destruction, but also to rebuilding. Okay, so where are we exactly? Let's understand. Okay, and for that, let's use a little bit marker, right, to understand where we are. Okay, so here is the old city, right? Here's Shar Shechem, here's the Kotel, right? Here we are is the old city. Har HaTzofim is to the northeast of the old city, right? So here's Hadassah. Right, the university is not on my Google map, but you know it's up here. We're going to see a close-up picture in a minute. And one of the things that makes this a special site, if you've ever been up here, you know, is you have on the one hand these spectacular views of the old city, and particularly of Har HaBayit, right? But on the other hand, you have these incredible views out to the east of the desert, right? And Har HaTzofim is really on the very edge of the desert. We're going to see that in a few different places around the university, where you really are just looking out towards eternity, right? Looking out towards the desert. Even with everything that's been built up today, you still have this incredible view towards the desert. So where are we going to go? Okay, on our Tiyol. And like I said, we can accomplish it in a much shorter period of time because we don't have to walk from one place to another. Okay, so we are going to start with the British Military Cemetery, which is really a super impressive place. Today, anyone who's been living in Jerusalem knows that one of the good things about the pandemic is that the city has been using the time to really make progress on things like the light rail. So the light rail is reaching all the way, and it's not always so accessible to get into the area of the cemetery, but it's at the very beginning when you're coming into the whole campus area of Har HaTzofim. So we're going to visit the cemetery, we're going to visit the medical center, and of course talk about Henrietta Henrietta Zold, who the tour was named after. And we are going to visit the university, which is rather large, right? Oh, takes in the synagogue, right? Takes in this whole place. Okay, so now that I've scribbled all over, those are most of the things. Those are the things we're going to see. Most of what we are going to see is from the end of World War I and onward. However, there are older pieces, okay, more recent older pieces, like from the late 19th century, and older pieces. We're going to see a place that goes back to Second Temple times. So we do have, like anything that is in proximity to the old city, we're always going to have layers upon layers upon layers of story, of history, of archaeology. So let's start out with the cemetery. Okay, as we all know, right, the British come and conquer the land of Israel in World War I from the Turks. This is a very significant, very important moment, not only for the Turks, obviously, it's the dying throes of the Ottoman Empire, but for Zionism, right? And as difficult as the British were to us and the terrible things that happened to us through the British, they were definitely a step up from the Ottoman Empire. And the conquest of the land of Israel by General Allenby, and especially the appointing of the first High Commissioner of Palestine, Herbert Samuel, who was a Jew, not only a Jew, he was a Jew who could read Hebrew, who came to the Chorva synagogue in the Old City on the first Shabbat that he was appointed. He was invited to come, and this was the Shabbos of Nachamu, Nachamu Ami. Right? This was a very powerful moment for the Jews of Eretz Israel. There really was a feeling that the British are coming. Of course, the Balfour Declaration is a piece of that. The British are coming, and they are going to free us, and the redemption is going to come. It doesn't come as easily. There are a lot of yisurim in this Geulah. There are a lot of difficulties, but the battles and the cemetery are very significant. So General Allenby comes up from the south, comes up from Egypt through Beersheba, reaches Jerusalem and conquers Jerusalem in December 1917, actually Hanukkah, okay? The city surrenders to him. And then he continues up towards the north, and by 1918, Palestine is conquered and the Ottoman Empire is gone. But there are a lot of casualties along the way. Now, there are 5 British war cemeteries in the land of Israel, and they are very uniform. Okay, there are rules about how they're supposed to look. Okay? In this cemetery, you have more than 2,500 soldiers who are buried here. You also have a memorial chapel for unknown soldiers. Okay, and that's the chapel that you see here in the background for more than 3,000 unknown soldiers. Okay. 5 different British cemeteries, British military cemeteries around the land of Israel. Okay, we'll see a couple of them, but Aza, Haifa, Ramla, Beersheba, and here. Okay, and people who know a little Jerusalem trivia might know that there's a strange little cemetery in Talpiyot of Indian soldiers. Okay? Indian soldiers on both sides, right? Indian Muslims. And Sikhs, if I'm not mistaken, and they are also remembered. Now, the cemetery, like I said, it has to be uniform. It's in a particular shape, in a cross shape. There's always the symbol of St. George, the patron saint of England. The way it's set up is a very classic design, but there are also Jews in the cemetery. Okay, there are 24 Jewish graves here. As you can see, they are marked, of course, with the Magen David, with the Star of David, and not with a cross. By the way, there's a movement, there's an organization that is working to find Jewish graves in military cemeteries, mostly from World War II. But a lot of Jewish soldiers, it wasn't necessarily known that they were Jewish when they were buried, and they were buried under crosses. And today there's an organization, Rabbi J.J. Schachter of New York is very involved in it, in finding out the Jewish origins of these soldiers and changing their monuments, changing their headstones to reflect that they were Jews. Okay? But here we have 24 Jewish graves out of the more than 2,500 that are in the cemetery itself. Every year in the second week of November, there's a ceremony with poppies, with bagpipes, all the things that you have all over the British Empire, or the remnants of the British Empire. One of the things that might be very evocative for Israelis, right? If you look at the headstones, they are identical. right? And the British did this, and we took this from them, that regardless of rank, you could have been a private for a month, you could have been a general for 40 years, you get the same headstone. If you've been to Mount Herzl or any other military cemetery, you know that Israel does the same thing. Okay? On this wall are recorded the names of officers and men of the armies of the United Kingdom, India, and South Africa who fell in Egypt and Palestine in the Great War and who have no known graves, right? Huge numbers that we don't know where they are. So think about that for a second. The cemetery is very powerful. On the one hand, most soldiers, even if you know their graves, were not brought home. And it was complicated. It was not simple to bring the bodies home, and they are buried in this foreign land, very, very far away. And even more painful, there are quite a lot that we don't even know where they were buried, and this is just a memorial to them. So it's a powerful cemetery. The cemetery is meant, and this is where we get back to our Harat Sofim connection, the cemetery is meant to look out on Jerusalem, right? When we say Jerusalem, we mean, of course, the old city. And the idea was there was supposed to be an unobstructed view of the old city forever. That was the idea. The British don't really purchase the land, but the city of Jerusalem guaranteed it. A few trees here and there need to be cut down, but you do have a view of the old city. And there's a very powerful idea here that the British fight here, they die here, and part of the story, and we always think of British anti-Semitism and anti-Israel, anti-Zionism, but there was a very strong current of philo-Semitism and even an identification of the British of themselves with ancient Israel. Right? And they see themselves as fighting for Jerusalem and the importance of Jerusalem. If you've ever seen the memorial, the monument that was put up at the entrance to the city by the central bus station today of the surrender of Jerusalem to General Allenby, the soldiers there look like crusaders, right? This connection going back to we are going to reclaim the Holy Land. And some British even see England as the New Jerusalem, right? We have this very famous poem by William Blake called Jerusalem, turned into a hymn sung in churches in the Church of England. I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land. All right, so this connection of Jerusalem, England, fighting for the Holy Land, it helps us to understand why this cemetery is such a significant one for the British soldiers to have as a memorial, and why the unknown soldiers are remembered here. There are other ones, okay, like I mentioned, Ramla has the strange claim to fame of having a grave of a soldier whose name was Harry Potter. Okay, and today many people come and take selfies by Harry Potter's grave. Poor Harry Potter, poor British young man who died in World War I and got some very strange measure of fame. But the cemetery that's been the most recently refurbished, not the cemetery, but the museum next to it, is this one that you see here on the left. This is in Beersheba, okay, and this is the Anzac Memorial, okay, Museum. November 1917 is when Beersheba is conquered, mostly by the Australian and New Zealand forces. And in order to commemorate the 100th anniversary in 2017, Israel and Australia and New Zealand probably put together the fastest museum ever, right? It was done in less than a year. It was really astounding. And it's a beautiful museum, very powerful museum, right next to the cemetery, which you can see here. The cemetery actually also has a Jewish grave, only one. And he actually was a Jew who chose to be buried, or his mother chose for him to be buried under a cross. She didn't want him to be buried as a Jew, but we know he was Jewish. But here's the museum in the back. It's a very modern, high-tech museum. Tells the very powerful story of the capture of Beersheba by the Anzac soldiers. So that's a very worthwhile place to visit when things get back to normal. And here on the right is this Indian cemetery in Talpiyot, which, as you can see, all of the cemeteries are incredibly well taken care of. That has nothing to do with Israel. It's very well manicured by the British government. They are the ones who pay for the upkeep of all the cemeteries. And if you go to any of them, and particularly the one on Harat Sofim, you'll see gardeners working there, right? And it's all paid for by the British Empire. So that's our introduction. That's our British story. Now, when the cemetery is built here, there is very little else on Har HaTzofim. But we are going to come to our next story, and that, of course, is the story of Hadassah Hospital, which doesn't get built here until the 40s, okay? And this amazing modern building will tell the story behind Hadassah, which, of course, is so much the story of Henrietta Zold, such an amazing, incredible woman. But just take a look at it for a minute at the original building. This is an old picture. This is from the 40s. Hadassah Hospital today on Mount Scopus has more modern buildings, but it also has this building. This building was preserved, was renovated because it's a historic building, because of the architecture we'll hear about in a second. Hadassah starts out in 1912, okay, in the land of Israel. By 1908, it has clinics, right? Healthcare, well baby clinics. By 1918, they have a small hospital, the Rothschild Hospital on Rehov HaNevi'im. They have hospitals in Tel Aviv and in Haifa. But by the 30s, it's very clear that there is not enough space and they need to build something else. Let's just take a look for a second. One of the first well baby clinics, it's very interesting. You don't see this emphasized in the Hadassah Visitor Center in Ankara, but it's important to understand. This is Beit Hadassah, which may be familiar to people. This is Beit Hadassah in Hebron, which of course is famous for its later history, post-Six-Day War, when there are Jews already finally allowed to settle in Kiryat Arba near Hebron, and then there are a group of women and children who move into this building and refuse to leave until Jews are allowed to live, to set up a community in Hebron proper. And there's a whole story to that. This is not a tour about Hebron, but it's interesting because this is Beit Hadassah. This was a Hadassah health clinic built in the 20s when there was a huge, not huge, but a significant and thriving Jewish population in Hebron. Hebron was growing, it was expanding. You had the Chabad presence there, you had the Yeshivat Hebron, all of it, of course, coming to a very abrupt halt with the terrible riots of 1929. But this is the Hadassah Clinic that was there until 1929 and then was reclaimed in the 1970s and is kind of the core of the beginnings of the Jewish community in Hebron proper. Let's talk a little about Henrietta, because Henrietta is definitely an important part of our story. So just to understand the two pictures that you have here, right? We'll talk about Henrietta Zold, of course, and this is Eric Mendelsohn, who was the first architect of Hadassah, and we'll get to him in a minute. But first about Henrietta Zold, because she is really one of the extraordinary women of Jewish history ever. Okay, just to read her dates. Okay, she's born in 1860 and she dies in 1945. Just think about the difference between those two, between her birth and her death. She's born at the beginning of the Civil War. Okay? She dies at the end of World War II. Think about the huge span of time that is in terms of modernity, in terms of women, in terms of the land of Israel. So many things change in those 85 years, and they're really incredible. Henrietta Zold is born in Baltimore. I don't know if we have any Baltimoreans here. Malki, right? Is a Baltimorean. And she is born into a very strong Jewish family. Okay, her father, Rav Binyamin Zold, is an educator. He and his wife are both very involved in Jewish immigration. A lot of new immigrants coming to Baltimore, and they are very involved in, first of all, just bringing people into their houses and making sure they can make a living, but also in Jewish education. Henrietta is one of 8 daughters. And you can imagine the rabbi father with no sons is teaching the daughters, right? That's what you do. Right? I think of Rashi and his daughters. So Henrietta gets an unusual for the time Jewish education. And she becomes involved in this family business of helping the immigrants. She teaches in night school to new immigrants, and she's involved in helping them to acclimate. But not only that, because she's also a scholar. Okay, she studies at the Jewish Theological Seminary. She applies to study at JTS in New York. She is accepted, the first woman to be accepted, on condition that she doesn't apply to study for the rabbinate. Remember, we're still in the 19th century here. Okay, so they accept her, but she can't, apply for smicha. She becomes the first editor of the Jewish Publication Society. She's a real scholar. And she has a thwarted love affair with Professor Louis Finkelstein, who falls in love with someone much younger than her and thinks of her as just a friend, right? A terrible story. And her mother, what do mothers do to comfort their daughters who are heartbroken? She says, let's take a trip. Where do they take a trip? They take a trip to the land of Israel. Okay? Take a trip to the land of Israel, 1910s. Henrietta's old, had never been here. Okay? She's already middle-aged. And she is at once awed and dismayed. Right? She's awed by the land of Israel, and it's so beautiful, and so many things are being built in progress, but she is very disturbed by the state of healthcare, which is terrible, right? Yes, there are some hospitals they're starting, but very, very, very bad. And she's not just disturbed, but she does something about it. And she goes home and she founds a women's organization called Hadassah, right? The first meeting is held around Purim time, so they name it Hadassah, Hadassah Hi Esther. And they found this women's organization to raise money to create a better healthcare system in Israel. Okay? She begins with the clinics. She moves on to the hospital. Eventually, in the 30s, she moves to Israel and she takes over from Recha Freier the job of youth aliyah, right, saving young people from Europe as Hitler is coming to power. And in 1945, she died, and she's buried on Har HaZeitim. She's one of the last, not the last, but she's one of the very important people buried on Har HaZeitim before everything is kind of cut off, right? 1948, Har HaZeitim is cut off from Jewish Jerusalem, but she is buried there. The caretaker of the Jewish cemetery on Har HaZeitim, Abed, who died a few years ago, he remembers picking out her grave, right? And this was, in the 2000s, he was talking about this in 1945. I love this picture of her because you can see her, on the one hand, she's still a very proper Baltimorean lady with her little hat. And on the other hand, she's not taking anything from anybody. She is there telling these kibbutzniks, what is the plan? How's it going to look? This is what I want, right? And she really was an incredible visionary. She never married. She never had children, but Mother's Day in Israel is on her yahrzeit because she's the mother of Israel. She really was a mother to so many children who she saves through her well baby clinics, through Youth Aliyah, so many different things like that. Eric Mendelsohn, on the other side, right? Eric Mendelsohn was the architect of this original building. He's a very complicated, interesting character. Right? He's an architect who worked in Berlin, had a very, very prestigious firm. He built the department stores of Zalman Schocken, right? We know Schocken books. Nobody makes money from books. He made money from his department stores, and he was able to use that money for the books. But he built Schocken's department stores, and they both did very well until, of course, the Nazis start to come to power. And then he has to find somewhere else to be. And he makes his way to the land of Israel. By the way, another weird little Jerusalem fact. If you know, there's another windmill on Rehov Ramban, not the famous windmill of Yamin Moshe, but there's another windmill in Rehavia, built by the Greek Orthodox Church. And Mendelsohn and his wife live in this windmill for a time. He thought it was romantic. I think it was also because they had no funds. He's a complicated character. He said about himself when someone asked him why his architecture office in Berlin, why he has no partners, he said, when God created the world, did he have partners? So this is the kind of person he is. But he comes to the land of Israel. He's given some very prestigious commissions, including building Chaim Weizmann's house in Rehovot. If you've ever seen it, you know it's an incredible house. And building Hadassah Hospital, as well as the university, which doesn't really happen. Okay, but he does build, let's just go back for a second, this first building of the university. He's very taken by this mixture of East and West, right? And that's where you could see the domes, this very Eastern, almost an Arabic kind of an influence, but also these very clean, modern lines. And he really tries to incorporate both those things. What happens to him, by the way, as Rommel is advancing, General Rommel of Nazis is advancing from North Africa, heading towards the land of Israel, he decides that he didn't leave Berlin in order to be caught by the Nazis in Palestine, and he picks himself up and he moves to America in the early 40s. So he definitely has an impact on the land of Israel in his architecture. I wouldn't say he was much of a Zionist. He was a Zionist by by necessity. Another very important story connected to Hadassah is what's called Shayeret Ha'ayin Chet, okay, the Convoy of the 78. On April 13th, 1948, there is a convoy heading up to the hospital, right? The hospital is finished in the early 40s, and there's already, it's a serious hospital, and there are doctors, and there are nurses, and there are equipment and patients who are coming in this convoy, and there are 10 vehicles, and near Sheikh Jarrah, right, East Jerusalem, on the way up to Mount Scopus, they are attacked by Arabs. The British do not intervene for over 8 hours, and you have 78 doctors, nurses, patients who are murdered. There's a memorial to them here on Har HaTzofim by the hospital. There's also a street named after them near where it happened in Musrara, the street of the 78, the Ayin Chet. At that point, the hospital is evacuated. So April 1948, already even before the city is officially divided and the ceasefire. Even before that, the hospital is considered to not be a safe place anymore. The patients are evacuated, and we're going to see that there's an alternate hospital that's built eventually in Karim. Between 48 and 67, the hospital is empty. Some of the equipment is used by the reserve units that are up there, but things really fall apart. They're not in great shape. But when Israel comes back, right, they decide that they can't quite bring themselves to knock down this historic building and to create something new and modern. Obviously, something that was built in the early 40s is not going to be adequate for a modern hospital, and yet there are these sentimental reasons to keep the old building. So they do keep the old building. They add new buildings. And of course, we have Hadassah and Karim, right, the other branch of Hadassah. Today, there are more than 1 million patients a year in Hadassah. There are 13,000 births a year in Hadassah, and the old building is there, and the newer buildings are there, and it's really a very impressive place, despite the troubles it's been going through in the past few years financially. But they seem to be picking themselves up. On the grounds, when you're looking out, first you can look out towards the desert, and you also have this sculpture by someone named Jack Lifshitz, the Tree of Life. I am not an art critic, so I'm not going to criticize, but it's meant to show all different kinds of scenes from Jewish history. Of course, the 10 Commandments on top, right? And it's a prominent site on the grounds of the hospital. But now we're going to come to our story of the university, which definitely takes up the bulk of the site of Mount Scopus, and perhaps takes up its mental bulk as well. Okay, it's a place that has such a strong load of idealism and ideology, a lot of which doesn't come to fruition, right? 1948 brings everything to a halt, as we're going to see, but we're not up to that yet. Okay. In the late 1880s, this handsome gentleman here, his name is John Grayhill. Okay, he was a Christian Zionist from England, a lawyer, and he and his wife would come to Jerusalem regularly, and they were very connected to Jerusalem. And eventually, he decides to buy himself a piece of land and build himself a house. And he decides to buy it on Mount Scopus. Why? Because there's empty space, there's land, right? There's room for it. It has beautiful views. So he buys himself a piece of land. He builds himself a home. But he's a strong believer in the Zionist movement, and he's a strong believer in a Jewish university. Right, very interesting. We're going to see the idea of a Jewish university is already kind of talked about in the late 19th century, before World War I, among Jews. But he is also talking about it already in 1913. He's talking about it. And he decides that, and he also needs some money, that he's going to sell his land to Arthur Rupin. Okay? Arthur Rupin, one of the important Jews involved in the Zionist movement, involved in purchasing land, and he sells his house in order to be used for a Jewish university. Now, the house itself, sadly, no longer exists. there's a little tiny plaque on the university grounds. There's really very little that is said about this man, who really was an extraordinary man, who really believed in the idea of a Jewish state, a Jewish university, but he is very much not remembered. Now, while he's building his estate, right, in 1902, there's an amazing discovery that's made on the grounds. And that's that there were people here way, way before the British and way before the Jews and the Jews of the 20th century. And these are the Jews of Second Temple times, okay? The Jews of Bayit Sheni times. What do they discover? They discover burial caves with ossuaries in them, with burial niches. Okay, this is a very exciting. It's discovered in 1902. Okay, and you can see this is how people buried in Second Temple times. They would dig out these caves, they would dig out openings, niches in the caves, and inside they would put ossuaries. What are ossuaries? Ossuaries are bone boxes. You would let the body disintegrate on a shelf. This is what they did in Bayit Sheni times, Second Temple times. The body would disintegrate. After a year, you would collect the bones and put the bones into a special box called an ossuary, or a gluskima in Aramaic. And this was done for a good few hundred years until they stopped doing it, and they just did one form of burial, putting the body straight into a sarcophagus, into a coffin. But here already, they're still using ossuaries, and here you can see how it's been kind of renovated. You can see the little niches. You can see the ossuaries that were discovered. Okay, very beautiful, kind of simply carved stone boxes. This is another clue that these are from Second Temple times, because unlike if you've ever gone up north to Beit Sha'arim and you've seen the sarcophagi there, which are from a few hundred years later, those are incredibly decorated, a lot of times with animal or even human or mythological figures. But things from Second Temple times, no imagery. Right? So you'll have rosettes, you'll have flowers, you'll have architectural details, but you won't have any pictures of people or of animals. Now, the most important ossuary that was discovered is not in our possession. It is today in the British Museum. And what's the story of it? So take a look. I want to make sure that I'm right, that it's in the British Museum. Yes. Okay. And take a look at it. Okay. It has an inscription in Greek. And then, if you can see, it has a little bit in Hebrew on the bottom here. Okay. What does the inscription in Greek say? All right. The inscription in Greek says, these are the bones of the house of Nicanor of Alexandria, who made the gates. And on the bottom, it says Nicanor Alexa. Okay, here is our friend Nicanor, who comes from Alexandria. Who's Nicanor who made the gates? If you know a little bit about the Beit HaMikdash, that is already should be ringing bells, right? Nicanor who made the gates. Here are the gates in the model, in the Holy Land model of Jerusalem. What are the gates? The gates are very famous. We have two versions of this story in the Gemara, right? But in both cases, we have this wealthy man named Nicanor, wealthy Jew, who lives in Alexandria in Egypt, and he wants to give a gift to the temple. So he takes his money and he makes these beautiful, ornate copper gates. Very, very beautiful, but they're very, very heavy. Now they have to be transported to the land of Israel. So what does he do? He hires a boat. He puts the gates on. They set sail. Okay, in one version of the story, they set sail for Yaffo. In another version, they set sail for Akko, wherever you are. That's the version you tell. Okay, but in our case, it doesn't matter. They set sail, and there's a terrible storm. Now, of course, the gates are very heavy, and the sailors say, well, we don't have any choice. We're going to drown. We have to throw one of these gates overboard and lighten the load of the ship. And they take the gate to Nicanor's incredible protests, and they throw it into the sea. But the storm continues, and there's nothing to do. And they say, well, we have no choice. We have to throw the other one over as well. And Nicanor throws himself on top of the gate, and he says, if you throw the gate, you're going to have to throw me, right? Like a Yonah story here, right? Except that they don't throw him, right? Because as soon as he does that, the sea calms, everything stops, the storm stops, and the boat comes safely to shore. But Nicanor is still distraught because he only has the one gate. And when they arrive at the shore of Jaffa or Akko, what's waiting for them on the beach? the other gate. Right? The other gate, and the Chazal say, the rabbis say, because it was such a miracle that was clearly done for Nicanor, therefore we put these gates in this very prominent place, right, between the women's court and the Azara, and they were not changed when everything was upgraded and changed to gold. These gates, even though they're only copper, they were still kept here. But to be able to find Nicanor's ossuary and to see his claim to fame, Nicanor who made the gates, right? That's an amazing thing. So that's what we have here in the caves here, in the burial caves here on Har HaTzofim. Now, this cave system, somebody who heard about it was one of the very powerful figures in the Zionist movement, Menachem Uzishkin. Right? People who have been in Rechavia or live in Rechavia know about Uzishkin Street. Uzishkin was what we like to call in Hebrew a bulldozer. Right? He was a bulldozer. Whatever he wanted to do, he was head of the JNF, of Karen Kayemet, and when he wanted something done, it got done. And what he wanted to do with these burial caves was to make them into the site of the National Pantheon. And in order to do that, by the way, he brings Leo Pinsker, okay, Yehuda Pinsker, one of the first early Zionists, founder of Lovers of Zion, of Chovevei Tzion, and he has him buried here. And he also arranges that when he dies, right, Ad Mea B'Esrim, when he dies in 1942, actually 1941, right, he will be buried here as well. Now, this is Menachem Uzishkin, really a very impressive kind of guy. There are all kinds of stories about how his street was really named Rabbi Yehuda Halevi Street, and he came along and said, no, this is going to be called Menachem Uzishkin Street, and he would polish his street sign every day. And when he died, he not only left instructions that he should be buried in this cave, right? Here's his grave. But he asked, now he was the head of the Karen Kayemet of JNF, which its responsibility was purchasing land and building new Jewish communities. And he instructed JNF to bring sacks of dirt from every one of the communities that he had founded or helped to found, and to put them on his grave. And that's this picture that you see here on the right. It's an amazing picture. His son said about him, Eze b'mai haya abba. What an amazing producer, director was my father. But in one thing, Menachem Uzishkin, despite his bulldozeriness, was not successful. This did not become the National Pantheon. Why not? Because 1948 happened. And 1948 happened, and that was it. This was cut off. There was no way to bury people here. This was in Israeli control, as we're going to see, but beyond the Green Line, beyond Jordanian territory. It was not a place that you could bring the great leaders to be buried or make as a military cemetery. And what happened instead, of course, as we all know, is that Mount Herzl was made into the pantheon of great leaders. So Menachem Uzishkin did not get to have his way here, even though it was a very beautiful idea, right? To take this place that had these ancient graves and to make this the place where later leaders would be buried. Didn't happen, right? When you go to see the caves, they are inside this very beautiful botanical gardens, right? People who know Jerusalem know that there's a botanical gardens on the western side of the city, but there's another botanical gardens. This is the first botanical gardens, and it was created in 1931. It was meant to be a place to study the flora of the land of Israel. This is very much a part of Zionism, coming back, learning the land, learning the plants, learning what Tanakh talks about when it talks about certain plants and animals. Because of the period between 48 and 67, it fell into terrible disrepair. But not so long ago, it was rehabilitated by a Jerusalem sculptor named Ron Morin, and today it's really a gorgeous place to come and visit. It was originally, by the way, not only a botanical gardens, but it was the first home of the Biblical Zoo, which some people here may remember when it was in Romema, and today, of course, it's in Malcha, but the first Biblical Zoo was here on Mount Scopus. Now, this is part, like I said, of this whole story of learning the land of Israel. So the one person who was very involved in the botanical gardens is in this picture here on the right. This is someone named Alexander Eig. He was a botanist here. He's planted planting the very first tree in the botanical gardens. Another couple who were very involved in this whole story of researching and understanding the plants of the land of Israel was a couple named Ephraim and Chana Haruveni. Now, if that name sounds familiar to you, it's because we have somebody named Noga Haruveni, who was their son, who created, who fulfilled their vision, which was to create a garden of biblical plants and animals. And that, of course, is Neo Kedumim. And he did it. It took quite a few years, but it happened. But his parents, Ephraim and Chana Haruveni, created a botanical library on Mount Scopus, a collection of plants, an encyclopedia of plants, and here they are, right? And again, all of this was brought to a very abrupt halt in 1948, and whatever could be saved was saved, but a lot of what they tried to do was really not able to be preserved because the mountain was taken over. Okay, let's talk a little about the university. Today, as you enter the university, they added recently these very nice descriptive signs. And these are showing some of the people who were great proponents of the idea of a Jewish university. Okay, Albert Einstein, everybody recognizes. We're going to talk about him a little later. Chaim Weizmann, of course. The bearded gentleman, I'm guessing most people do not recognize. His name was Herman Shapiro. He was a math professor, but he was also a very strong Zionist. And he was a strong proponent of the idea of a Jewish university. And here, hiding in the corner here, is Theodor Herzl, who was also involved. And this suggestion was already made at the first Zionist Congress in 1897. And fascinatingly, there were quite a few people who objected to the idea of a Jewish university. They said, we are going back to the land to be laborers, to connect to the land, right? Anu banu arza livnot ulehibanot. We've come to the land to build and to be built up, to be rebuilt. We don't need any more of these pale yeshiva students shuckling over their books. We want to be workers. Who needs a university? Fortunately, this school of thought did not win. And the proponents of the university did succeed. It took a while, right? The first cornerstone is only laid in 1918, right? World War I, British conquest, all of this kind of interrupts the process of acquiring the land and making the plans. Cornerstone is laid in 1918. The official opening ceremony only in 1925, but the seeds are already planted in 1897. And the vision of this university is a fascinating one. Right? Everyone who talks about the university, right, from the most secular to the most religious, describes it somehow as a temple. Okay, Chaim Weizmann and Achad Ha'am and Uzishkin and Bialik and Judah Magnus, everyone talks about this university as a temple. Okay, part of it in its geographical connection to the temple, right? It's very close by, but also it's meant to be, certainly by the more secular, right? Rav Kook doesn't talk like this, a replacement for the temple. Here, we don't have a temple anymore. This is going to be a temple with learning instead of ritual. And you can get the sense of that by taking a look at this drawing and the pin that was made in commemoration of the drawing. This was made by Patrick Geddes, who we're going to talk about in a minute. He was the planner, the first planner of the university. And he creates this incredibly grandiose vision, which, if you look at it, looks a heck of a lot like the Dome of the Rock. Right? And the idea is that we are connecting to the temple, even if it's a completely secular temple, right? It's a temple without religion, according to Judah Magnus, right? But we want to have, this is going to be the focal point of the New Jerusalem. It's going to be a transition from ritual and sacrifice to learning, right? Beit Mikdash to Beit Midrash, like that process that we had already 2,000 years earlier. That's a lot of the language that's being used. This is not just a university, right? It's got a lot more writing on it. It's very, very important to the Zionists, this whole vision, to the extent that in 1937, when the Peel Commission divides up Jerusalem, and they want to give only very few parts to Jews, the Zionists choose to keep Mount Scopus. It doesn't happen, right? But they choose to take Mount Scopus and the area of the university over the area of the Jewish quarter and the Western Wall. crazy, right? But this is so important to the Zionist identity. Now, who are the fellows here? This one with the lovely beard, right? This is Patrick Geddes. He's a Scotsman. He is an urban planner of Jerusalem. He's brought in by the British, and he's hired by the university to plan out what it's going to look like. And we saw some of his plan. It was very expensive. It was not very practical. Eric Mendelsohn, who we saw before, was involved. Then he leaves. Then Richard Kaufman. And then the war, right? Then there's World War II. Then there's the War of Independence. So the university never gets completely finished in its first incarnation. The person on the right here is Judah Leib Magnus, very interesting character, very American. Right, from the West Coast, from California, Reform rabbi, family that's kind of been in America already for a few generations, which is rather unusual in the early 20th century. And he is a pacifist. He's actually against American involvement in World War I. And he is the rabbi of Temple Emmanuel in New York, and he kind of becomes persona non grata after he is against World War I. And he comes to the land of Israel, and he becomes the first chancellor of the university. He's a very good fundraiser, but he is very interested in a binational state, right? A state of Arabs and Jews together. And he's a little too liberal for the university. And ultimately, he's kind of pushed out. He doesn't have as much control as he had before. The cornerstone of the university is laid on Tu B'Av, right? The middle of the month of Av, a holiday, 1918, but it's only dedicated in 1925. And it was a very big deal to get one of these little tickets, right? One of these admission tickets to the ceremony, which was held, as we'll see in a minute, in the amphitheater overlooking the desert. Who was there? Everybody was there. Lord Balfour and Chaim Weizmann and Bialik and Achad Ha'am and the High Commissioner Herbert Samuel and Rav Kook. Everybody who was anybody in Palestine in 1925 was at this ceremony. Is memorialized by this painting by an artist named Pilchowski, who shows, here's Lord Balfour speaking, and if you go to the university, they have it actually with an index with a key showing you who everybody is. But he really got a lot. Here's Rav Kook over here. Bialik is next to him. All right, you have anyone who is the who's who of Palestine of those days is at this ceremony, and it gives you a sense of how significant this moment was. It's held in the amphitheater that's overlooking the desert. Just as it's important for the university to be connected to the Temple Mount and to the Old City and to the history of the past of Jerusalem and of the Jewish people, it was also very important to them that they were connected to the desert. Right? The desert is a place of new beginnings, a view to eternity, right? As Eric Mendelsohn said, today you go out there and you see, well, there's a lot more that's built up, and you can see a lot of Isawiya, which is a neighborhood right outside of Jerusalem, perhaps the biblical Nov, okay, where we don't know 100%. One of the things that's very interesting, this goes back to Noga HaReuveni, right? Remember him from the El Kedumim. And he, when he's a young man in the 50s, he writes a book about Yirmiyahu, or Chadash al Sefer Yirmiyahu, a new look at the book of Jeremiah. And he's looking at it in the context of the geography and the topography of the land of Israel. And he says that Jeremiah is often trekking from Anatot, north of Jerusalem in Binyamin, to the Old City. And in one prophecy, he describes Jerusalem. He says, Yerushalayim Yoshevet Ha'emek, sitting in the valley. You say, Jerusalem is sitting in the valley? Jerusalem's not sitting in the valley. Jerusalem's on the mountain. If you're coming from Mount Scopus, Jerusalem's sitting in the valley, right? It's below you. So Noga HaReuveni shows how once you understand the land, you understand the prophecy much better. So that connection to the desert is also important. The earliest buildings, right? The very first building is the National Library. Right, and that's the building that you can see here. This isn't an old picture. This is what it looks like today. Today, it's part of the law school building, and this is again, there are buildings that are built kind of piecemeal. The larger picture is never really realized. This was built in 1929. And it all kind of grinds to a halt between 48 and 67, when Moshe Dayan comes up on Mount Scopus on the second day of the 6-Day War. This is the building that he goes to the roof to look out of, and he sees the Temple Mount, and he says, what a divine view. Right? He still doesn't agree that it should be conquered, but he's very impressed by the view. Okay, what's the connection of Albert Einstein? Albert Einstein, of course, we know, very, very famous Jew, escapes the Nazis, comes to New Jersey, is a professor in Princeton, but his whole life, very, very strong Zionist, a strong believer in the Jewish state, and a strong believer in a Jewish university, right? Not only because he believes in science and in education, but because he sees it as a haven for Jewish scholars. He knows Jewish scholars are going to be stuck and trapped in Europe, and they need to get out. And this will be a way for them to come and to be able, they didn't know how trapped they were really going to be, but this was going to be a way for them to continue their professions, but in a Jewish university. And he strongly believes in Jewish values, and he remains connected to the university his whole life. He gives the very first lecture in the math building, right, which is today called Machon Einstein, right, the Einstein Institute of Math. He gives the first lecture in 1923, so the very first lecture that's ever been given in the university, even before the dedication ceremony. He starts out, he gives a lecture in French. He's not that fluent in Hebrew, but he starts out the lecture in Hebrew so that the first words that are said in the university in an official capacity are in Hebrew. Einstein was so connected to the university that he willed all of his intellectual property to the university, which makes a very nice amount of money for the university today, meaning not just his scientific treatises, but his image, right? And the coffee mugs with him sticking out his tongue, that's owned by Hebrew University. So that has done very well for the university over the years. Okay, one more building before we get to the story between 48 and 67. One of these early buildings, okay, this one not built till 1941, but it's a very important building. It's called Beit HaNechut LaAtikot HaYehudim, right, which today we call the archaeology building. Really a treasure house for the ancient treasures of the Jewish people. Okay? And again, this whole idea of coming back to the land and unlocking its secrets and our connection between the land and our Zionism. The founder here, the head of the archaeology department, is Professor Eliezer Sukenik, and the father of Yigael Yadin, but also very, very involved with the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Biblical Encyclopedia, really a very, very important archaeologist. And this is a good place to mention some of the early professors in Hebrew University. And if you know anything about Jewish studies, okay, this is the who's who of Jewish studies. Okay? Yitzchak Ber, Martin Buber, Hugo Bergman, Gershon Kaplan, Gershon Shalom, Mordechai Kaplan, Klausner, Goitein, everybody who's anybody in Jewish studies, and quite a few everybody's who's anybody's in the maths and the sciences, teach in the Hebrew University. And it really was a haven for Jewish scholars who are coming to the land of Israel in an incredible way. So the archaeology building, this building is still standing. And it has a small museum with some artifacts, some original, some copies for the students to learn from. But let's go back to our political story. We're almost finished here, but this is a very important part of the story. Okay? Between 48 and 67, Jerusalem is divided. Okay? By September 48, the battles are over. Moshe Dayan and Abdallah Attal sit down in an abandoned house in Musrara to draw out the line of what the Jordanians control, what the Israelis control. It's a fascinating story in and of itself, this line and the no man's land between it. But what's important for us is, of course, the old city is under Jordanian control. Mount Scopus, to the east of the old city, is controlled by Israel. Okay? And we are not willing to give it up because it's a very important, very strategic position. However, it's completely isolated within Jordanian territory. So Israel retains control of it, but obviously it cannot be used anymore as a hospital, as a university. It becomes a military base. Now, under the rules of the ceasefire agreement, only policemen were allowed to come up here. but it was a very open secret that all different kinds of units came up here, and and then they would ask them at the crossing point, right, at the Mandelbaum Gate, what kind of policemen are you? Are you infantry? Are you paratroopers? Right? Everybody knew they weren't policemen. And little by little, over the 19 years, they built up a whole stockpile of armaments because they know eventually the war is going to come. And ultimately, what happens in the Six-Day War is that Israel takes Ammunition Hill, right over the Green Line, jumps towards the Rockefeller Museum, and ultimately up to Mount Scopus and around to take the Old City. So it's very, very important in capturing the Old City in June of 1967. But those 19 years of neglect really take a toll on the buildings of the hospital and the university. And of course, new campuses are built, right? Little by little. It doesn't happen right away. In the beginning, they kind of make do with buildings in all sorts of places, in Mamila and Rehavia. But ultimately, the hospital gets a new campus on the very, very edge of Jerusalem, Ein Karim, which turned out to be a very smart choice because it gave it lots of room to expand. And today, Ein Karim is a much, much larger hospital, a much, much larger campus with all the modern new buildings, and a new university campus in Givat Ram. Today, both campuses of both institutions are used, but it's always a great example of how Jerusalem, even places like educational institutions and hospitals, are determined by wars and by politics. When Israel came back, after 67, there was a new campus that was planned. It has been universally panned by everybody as being very, very difficult to navigate, maze-like, but it does have a few beautiful things. Among them, the Hecht Synagogue, which has an incredible, incredible view if you're in the men's section, not in the women's section, but an incredible view to the Temple Mount, to Har HaBayit. In this plaza, which is called the Frank Sinatra Plaza, Frank Sinatra and Nancy Reagan gave a lot of money to Hebrew University. There's a memorial here by the same Ron Morin who redid the Botanical Gardens. And you can see it's a tree that's kind of tilted in this strange way. This is a memorial to the 2002 terror attack where 9 students were murdered by an Arab worker from Silwan who worked in the university. So this is a very kind of subdued but important memorial to the terror attack that was there. And we'll just finish by looking out at eternity, looking at the desert, still incredible, even with everything that's been built up. And Mount Scopus, Harat Sofim, still Sofeh to Jerusalem, but to the desert as well, with so many pieces and stories from throughout Jewish history. So I'm stopping sharing. I'm going to take a look at chat questions. People who want to ask questions, please feel free. Okay, so let's see. What does Neely stand for? That I am not going to answer. I will let Emma do that when I'm finished. How do we know Rabbi Akiva was not standing on the Tayelet in Arnona, asks Esther. That's a good question. It sounds like they're coming from the north, but again, we don't have any great proof. All right. Can anyone go see the British Cemetery? Yes, British Cemetery is open to everybody. This is being recorded. Whoever wanted to know, Emma will tell you about that. Okay, can you tell the story of the relationship of Nathan Strauss to Henrietta? I know Nathan Strauss was a very important philanthropist in Israel, but I know he was involved in Tipat Chalav, right? He gave money for the milk, for the well baby clinics, not milk, and he was also very involved with pasteurized milk, but he also gave money for well baby clinics, but I don't know about him and Hadassah, so if anybody wants to add that. Otherwise, I will have to do some research. Is Mount Scopus safe to go to? Mount Scopus is definitely safe to go to. The university is closed these days. Hospital is open. Take the bus. Eventually, you'll be able to take the light rail. Archaeology Museum is not open right now. And in Talpiyot, the Indian cemetery is on... What street is it? It's not the street of Agnon's house. It's the one parallel to it. Koreha Dorot, I believe, is the street that it's on, right? In Old Talpiyot. Other questions or comments? Emma, if you want to say something about the recording and about Neely. Oh, Esther has given us Nathan Strauss presents Health Shelter in Jerusalem. I will read it. I don't know. Yes, Emma, I'm giving it back to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Shulie. That was really amazing. And like Shulie said, something that would have taken us 4 hours. Obviously, we would love to be walking through the streets of Har HaTzofim and the entire Hebrew University and Hadassah Hospital campus with Shulie. But if we can't do that right now, then this was a definitely great second best option. So thank you so much, Shulie. And in terms of what does Neely stand for, Neely stands for, this is my son, Zevi. Zevi can say hi to everyone. Nashim Lomdot Yachad. Nashim Lomdot Yachad. And it is, again, the women's initiative of the YU Torah Mitzion Kollel in Chicago. And in terms of the recording, we will be just getting it together, and feel free to reach out. I'm putting in the chat info@torahchicago.org, and we can send you the recording if you miss parts. Thank you so much for joining this morning on behalf of Matan and Neely, and we look forward to having you join our programs again in the future.
Thank you, everyone. It was wonderful seeing so many people. Come back to Israel soon. We're getting our vaccinations here. You guys get them too.
Yes.
And
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
We're not as good as Israel.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me.
thank you, Shulie.
Thank you, Shulie. This was a wonderful joint effort. Neely, Matan, amazing. We're all together. We're all together here, walking the streets of Eretz Yisrael. I see Corinne. I saw Vivian, Jossie, Bobby, Leah, so many from Chicago and others in New York and Israel. Hi, oh, here's Bobby. Wonderful. Great to see everybody. We miss you.